Hey guys, tonight we begin with a subject both notorious and misunderstood, the hidden, dizzying and occasionally downright brutal world of the Japanese courtesan. It was an era of elegant rituals and equally elaborate rules. A time when survival meant knowing your poetry, perfecting your bow, and making sure your secrets stayed tucked tighter than your obi. So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And let me know in the comments where you're tuning in from and what time it is for you. It's always fascinating to see who's joining us from across the globe. Now dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. Let's start with the biggest misconception. Life as a courtesan didn't unfold beneath petals drifting in moonlit gardens while a gentle shamisen played softly in the background. In reality, the setting was usually a narrow room behind sliding doors, shared by girls who'd been sold to the pleasure quarter, each with her own story, and an endless parade of clients with more opinions than manners. Privacy, as we think of it, simply didn't exist. Most courtesans lived in brothels where the kitchen, parlour and sleeping quarters were technically the same square footage, just with different perfumes and very different expectations. If a girl wanted a moment to herself, she had to get creative. Timing mattered, so did silence, and ideally so did whether the madam was watching and whether the other girls were in a generous mood. Curtains were a luxury. Beds were shared, and even among the highest ranked, attendants might be awake at the foot of the futon or pretending to sleep behind a paper wall. Many brothels kept careful records of room assignments, debts, and nightly guests, which is exactly as awkward as it sounds. Travelling didn't help either. Courtesans on the move often had to share rooms, futons, and rumours with strangers, which made everything more complicated. Want a little comfort? You'd better check if the room is empty and whether someone already claimed the best pillow. If you were a senior courtesan and still awake and reasonably presentable, you could steal a few minutes of quiet and hope for the best. If you weren't, well, you had to be twice as quiet and 3 times as careful. Communities were small, walls were thin, and gossip travelled faster than the first rickshaw at dawn. For those living in the strictest houses, the rule was simple. No privacy, no distractions, and certainly no midnight whispers. But even there, human nature occasionally made things complicated, which explains why so many madams preferred rooms with extra locks and extra doors. In the pleasure quarters, few things shaped daily life more than the brothel's rulebook and the ever-watchful eyes of the madam. These women had a lot to say about what went on behind closed doors, or more accurately, behind barely closed sliding screens. According to the rulebooks, a courtesan's main function was to entertain, to serve, and above all, to bring profit. That was it. Not romance, not happiness, not escape, just survival and a good return on investment. Everything else was distracting at best, dangerous at worst. This wasn't just bedtime pep talk. Brothel owners, senior courtesans, and even city officials wrote detailed instructions on what was and wasn't allowed, just in case anyone dared to improvise. Certain days of the week were off limits. So were festival nights, religious holidays, and in some quarters, the nights when a favoured client was expected to arrive. Want to sneak out for a breath of fresh air during Obon? Think again. New Year's? Also number. That left maybe a rainy Tuesday in late autumn if you were lucky. Even within the brothel, there were expectations. Courtesans were encouraged to approach their work with grace and restraint. Flirtation was acceptable, but not too much. Displays of emotion were, to put it mildly, frowned upon. One legendary madam once suggested that the perfect courtesan should offer beauty without hope, affection without attachment, and conversation without a single secret slipping through, which is, by all accounts, a fairly joyless checklist. The preferred method was to always keep a mask on, never too familiar, never too cold. It was considered the safest, and therefore the least likely to anger the madam, the clients, or the officials who kept tabs on the floating world. Anything else was considered suspect. That includes things like genuine laughter or, heaven forbid, falling in love. Confession of a sort also got involved. Senior courtesans and madams often asked pointed questions to make sure no one had broken the rules, at least not in any way that might hurt business. These weren't vague spiritual inquiries. They were very specific, sometimes uncomfortably so. Let's just say the average brothel madam knew far more about her girls' secrets than about their birthdays. Still, enforcement was uneven. Some houses were stricter than others. Some madams ignored these rules entirely. And many courtesans, especially the clever ones, simply smiled, nodded, and did what they were going to do anyway, quietly. If you think modern folks have trouble finding time to relax, spare a thought for the women of Yoshiwara. Planning a quiet night in the floating world required a rule book, the madam's approval, and the luck of the cherry blossoms themselves, which, as anyone will tell you, never lasted long. If you want to know how someone ends up behind the willow fence, it usually doesn't start with dreams of silk and poetry. Most of the time, it starts with a knock at the door, a parent whispering about debts, a bad harvest, or the family's only cow not making it through the winter. There's this old saying that nobody chooses Yoshiwara, the place chooses you, usually when life has already handed you a losing ticket. For a lot of girls, the story began out in the countryside, where rice fields stretched farther than you could run, and hope seemed to shrink with every passing season. Maybe your family had too many mouths to feed. Maybe your father fell ill. Maybe the rains never came. Whatever the reason, there came a moment when someone, maybe a desperate father, maybe an uncle, maybe a mother with red-rimmed eyes, signed a contract. Money changed hands. Sometimes there were tears. Sometimes there weren't even goodbyes. And just like that, you were on your way to the city, clutching a bundle of clothes, not quite sure if you'd ever see home again. If you were lucky, the journey took only a day. If you were less lucky, you got handed from merchant to merchant, riding in the back of a cart, listening to strangers talk about the price of fish and the weather, feeling smaller with every mile. Eventually, you'd reach Edo. The city itself was a noisy, confusing blur. Temples, bridges, the steady hum of people who looked like they belonged somewhere, even if you never would. Then, finally, the willow fence. Tall, impenetrable, and always just a little too quiet. The gate would open, someone would usher you inside, and, for all intents and purposes, your old life was over. The first night inside the pleasure quarter was nothing like the stories. There were no welcoming lanterns or friendly faces, just a madam with eyes that missed nothing, a blur of other girls, and the thick scent of incense mixed with boiled rice. You learned fast that everything had a place, and you were at the very bottom. You'd be given a new name, usually something cute, maybe the name of a flower or a bird, always just unusual enough that it never quite felt like yours. That old life, your family name, the games you played in the dirt, the way your mother called you in at dusk, all of that was left outside the gate, as unreachable as last year's cherry blossoms. If you were small, you'd become a Kamuro, a sort of apprentice in training and living house helper. Your job? Everything and nothing. You'd fetch tea, run errands, scrub the tatami, and listen to the older girls as they whispered about clients and lessons and secrets you wouldn't understand for years. Most of all, you'd learn to keep your head down, watch everyone, and never be the last one awake or the first one to speak. Every day brought new instructions, new faces, and a growing sense that the only way out was to keep moving up, never sideways, never back. There were lessons in the morning: how to bow properly, how to pour tea without spilling, how to kneel without your legs going numb, how to smile even if you didn't feel like it. You watched as the older girls applied white powder to their faces, pinned up their hair with a dozen ornaments, and laughed at jokes that didn't sound funny at all. At night, you'd lie awake, listening to the shuffle of feet on the wooden floors, the distant music from the main street, and the occasional cry, quickly muffled, when someone had a bad dream or just missed home too much to pretend anymore. Some madams ran their houses with iron fists, rules written on wooden boards, punishments swift and public. Forget to clean something? No dinner. Talk back. Double chores. Break a hairpin. Apologize, then go without it until someone decided you'd learned your lesson. Other madams were softer, but softness didn't last long in a world where every mistake cost money and every extra mouth had to earn its keep. There were, of course, small mercies. Sometimes an older girl would sneak you a sweet bun after the others had gone to bed, or teach you a song your mother never knew. There were moments, just moments, when laughter felt real, usually after a festival, or when someone managed to sneak a look at a parade in the street. You'd catch a glimpse of dancers, bright kimono, the sound of drums, and for a second, it almost felt like being part of something beautiful. But mostly, life was a test of patience and endurance. The line between friend and rival was thin. One day you'd share a secret with the girl sleeping next to you. The next, you'd overhear her telling someone else and realize trust was just another thing you'd have to learn all over again. Some girls dreamed of escaping. They'd stare out the window at dusk, eyes fixed on the world beyond the fence, wondering if anyone out there still remembered their name. Every once in a while, you'd hear a story about a girl who'd managed to send a letter home, or a family who'd come looking for their daughter and bought her freedom. These stories were told in whispers, always late at night, and always with the understanding that hoping for such things was dangerous. Most contracts lasted years. Some never ended at all. The world outside quickly faded. You became part of the house, as much a fixture as the teapot or the sandals lined up at the door. Time moved differently inside the pleasure quarter, a blur of chores, lessons, whispered gossip, and the slow, steady realization that growing up here meant learning how to hide every real feeling and replace it with a practiced smile. If you ever did get a chance to leave the house, it was only under close watch, maybe to run an errand or help prepare for a festival. Even then, you walked quickly, eyes down, hands full, knowing that freedom was something you'd heard about but never truly felt. And so the cycle continued. New girls arrived. Old ones disappeared, some promoted, some sent away, some just gone. Through it all, the madam kept her records, the house kept its secrets, and you kept your head down, trying to make sense of a world that seemed designed to make you forget where you came from. It's easy to look back and romanticize the life of a courtesan, the poetry, the music, the silk, but for most girls, it began with a contract and a promise that was never meant to be kept. The real journey was about learning how to survive, one carefully measured step at a time. So if you're still awake, tuck yourself in a little deeper and think about those first nights behind the willow fence, how quickly the world could change, and how long it sometimes took to find your place in it. Growing up inside the pleasure quarters was a little like living in a perpetual dress rehearsal, always practicing, never quite certain when the real show would start, or if you'd even be invited onto the stage at all. One day, if you survived long enough, you'd find yourself promoted. No announcement, no grand party, just a quiet word from the madam. Tomorrow, you start your training as a shinzo, an apprentice courtesan. Suddenly, you're no longer just a helper or a shadow. You're on a path, and everyone knows it, including the other girls who now watch you just a bit more closely, their eyes quick to spot mistakes, and even quicker to remember them. Becoming a shinzo meant more than getting a new sash or a slightly softer futon. It meant that every moment of your day, waking, eating, walking, even resting, was now an audition. Your real lessons began before sunrise, and most days they didn't end until the last lamp had been snuffed and the corridors had gone silent. The madam, never much for sentiment, would lay out the new rules. You were to join the older girls in their training. That meant music practice with the house's resident shamisen teacher, endless drills in dancing, hours memorizing lines of poetry, and the most important art of all, learning how to carry yourself with poise even when your heart was racing or your stomach was empty. There was no room for clumsiness. Every mistake was a black mark, every misstep a reason for someone to call you unready or, worse, hopeless. Some of the older courtesans made a game of it, testing you, sending you for impossible tasks, correcting your form with sharp whispers and an even sharper hairpin. If you were lucky, one of them might take pity and show you how to hold a fan so it fluttered just so, or how to bow with exactly the right tilt of your head so the customer felt respected but not superior. If you weren't lucky, you learned fast to fix your own mistakes and hide the tears until you were safely alone. Breakfast was quick, maybe a bowl of rice, a sip of tea, because nobody paid to see a courtesan eat. Then it was straight to the dressing room, where the daily ritual of transformation began. The older girls would help you at first, their hands surprisingly gentle as they worked white powder into your skin, painted careful lines around your eyes, and combed your hair into styles that felt more like architecture than fashion. Every layer had meaning, the under kimono for modesty, the main kimono for beauty, the outer robe for status. All of it was heavy, hot, and expensive. You learned quickly to move without wrinkling the fabric or stumbling over the long, trailing sleeves. Your obi, the thick, elaborate sash that tied it all together, could take 3 people to knot correctly, and by the end, you felt more like a carefully wrapped parcel than a person. By mid-morning, lessons resumed. There were poems to memorize, gestures to perfect, and etiquette drills that tested your patience as much as your memory. You practiced walking, yes, just walking, on tall wooden gaiter, the kind of shoes that made every step feel like a test of balance and courage. One slip, and you could tumble in front of the house guests or, worse, the madam herself. The threat of public embarrassment was as real as any punishment. When the clients arrived in the afternoon, the entire house seemed to shift. Even if you weren't yet allowed to entertain them, you watched everything. The way the Oiran tilted her head to listen, the sly way she laughed at a merchant's story, the quick glances exchanged between rivals and allies alike. The most successful courtesans made conversation look effortless, but you knew from whispered warnings that every laugh was measured, every compliment carefully calculated for effect. If a client was important, you took mental notes. If he was dangerous, you learned his moods and made sure to be somewhere else if tempers flared. Sometimes, if you'd worked especially hard or just been very lucky, the madam would allow you to help serve at a tea ceremony. This was the closest you'd get to the real stage. A small chance to show you were more than just a servant. You poured sake, offered poems, recited lines you'd rehearsed 100 times in the dark. Your hands shook, but you hid it by moving slowly, gracefully, pretending you were already used to the stares and the laughter. Every word mattered. Every gesture was recorded in someone's memory, ready to be praised or mocked later, when you were out of sight. Of course, not everything was about performance. There was the practical side of apprenticeship, endless chores, quiet rivalries, and an education in the house's pecking order. Senior girls could be generous, offering tips or an extra bite of dinner, but they could also be ruthless. A misplaced hairpin, a dirty hem, a smile at the wrong client. These could earn you a night scrubbing the courtyard or a week's worth of cold stares. Sometimes alliances shifted with the weather. One day you might be a confidant, the next, a target. It paid to keep your secrets to yourself, or share them only with the girls who understood how quickly fortunes could change. After dark, the house softened a little. The girls would gather in the back, whispering stories from their hometowns, humming songs from memory, or passing around a bit of sweet bean paste saved from dinner. The youngest would nod off early, exhausted by lessons and the weight of expectations. The older ones stayed awake, their voices low, their laughter softer, nursing the kind of bruises that didn't show up on skin. Sometimes, when the mood was right, someone would tell a story about a courtesan who'd made it out, a legend, half hope and half warning. More often, the talk turned to survival, how to avoid a cruel client, how to read the madam's moods, how to make yourself useful without being too noticeable. Sleep never came easy. The thick, cloying scent of old incense hung in the air, and every noise in the night seemed amplified by the paper-thin walls. You drifted off to the distant sound of the shamisen, the memory of steps echoing down the corridor, and the half-formed dreams of what tomorrow might bring. You learned to wake before dawn, just in case the madam came looking. You learned to wash quickly, dress quietly, and start each day as if the last hadn't happened at all. Through it all, your sense of self shifted, sometimes without you even noticing. The person you'd been before the pleasure quarters, the one with a real name, a favourite game, a home, started to fade. In her place grew someone else, a girl who measured her words, who smiled when she was expected to, who survived by blending in until it was time to stand out. It wasn't just about pretending, it was about becoming. Every poem learned, every calligraphy stroke mastered, every tiny, perfect bow was another step toward the person you had to be if you wanted to keep moving up. But even as you trained and changed and learned the ways of the house, a small part of you never stopped watching, never stopped hoping. Maybe one day you'd be the one giving advice, the one who knew all the secrets. Or maybe you'd find a way to escape, not just from the house, but from the life that had chosen you long before you ever set foot behind the willow fence. And so, every morning, you painted your face white, tied your hair up with aching arms, and stepped out into the world the house had built for you. Each day a test, each night a rehearsal, each moment a tiny battle between who you were and who you were expected to become. That was the art and that was the price of learning to survive as an apprentice in the floating world. For all the hours spent practicing, all the poetry recited and calligraphy brushed out on crisp white paper, there was one moment in a young courtesan's life that cast a longer shadow than any other. Mizuaj. You'd hear the word whispered long before it applied to you, passed between girls who pretended not to care, who laughed about it with a shrug, but whose eyes gave away something sharp and anxious beneath the bravado. Every apprentice knew the day would come. Everyone just hoped it would come later, not sooner. But in the pleasure quarter, time moved according to someone else's clock. Mizuaj meant a girl's transition from apprentice to full courtesan. On paper, it was a ritual, a coming-of-age event dressed up in silk and tradition. In reality, it was a transaction, the auctioning off of a young girl's virginity to the highest bidder. It was business, but with all the trappings of celebration, as if a festival could make the price less cruel. There were signs your mizuaj was coming. The madam would start inspecting you more often, her eyes lingering a little longer, calculating. Your training would intensify. Longer hours, more complicated songs, stricter posture corrections, a sharper eye on your every movement. Suddenly, the house had higher hopes for you. The better you performed, the higher the bids. The more alluring your conversation, the more patrons started to take an interest. You learned to smile through it all, even as the other girls began to avoid your gaze, each secretly relieved it wasn't her turn. When the day finally arrived, it came without warning. One morning, the madam would wake you earlier than usual, her voice softer than normal, but with an edge that cut through any hope of protest. You'd be bathed in water scented with flower petals, your skin scrubbed until it stung. Your hair would be dressed higher and heavier than ever before, weighed down with ornaments that dug into your scalp. The oldest, most formal kimono would be pulled from storage, a shimmering thing with sleeves that swept the floor and a sash so wide you could hardly breathe. By the time the makeup was done, you hardly recognized yourself in the polished bronze mirror. The house would bustle with energy, a nervous excitement that made everyone's voices just a little too high, their laughter a little too sharp. The other girls watched you with a complicated mix of pity, envy, and fear. You caught snatches of gossip as you were led through the halls. Who was bidding, how much they might pay, whether the client would be gentle or rough, young or old, a stranger, or worse, a regular. For the men, it was an event. The wealthiest and most powerful patrons vied for the honour, more for the status than anything else. Winning a girl's miswage was like acquiring a rare treasure or making a statement to the rest of the city. The ceremony itself was part theatre, part negotiation. Sometimes there were offerings, sometimes music, always far too many eyes. The price, once agreed, would be whispered about for weeks. It didn't really matter if the girl was ready. Her readiness was never part of the contract. When the time finally came, you were ushered into a private room, its paper walls as thin as ever, the scent of incense heavy in the air. Maybe the madam was there, or maybe an older courtesan you trusted a little more than the rest. The man would arrive, dressed in his best, eyes alight with something you tried not to name. He might make small talk, try to be charming, pretend for a moment that you were equals, or he might not say a word, making it all the more terrifying. The ritual, for all its formality, couldn't disguise what was about to happen. Every girl handled it differently. Some tried to disappear into their own minds, counting heartbeats or studying the ceiling for patterns. Others focused on details, how cold the floor felt, the scratch of embroidery at their neck, the way the incense smoke curled upward and vanished. There was pain, always, sometimes more than you'd imagined. But even more than pain, there was the knowledge that you were no longer the person you'd been just a few hours ago. Something had shifted, quietly and forever. Afterwards, there was little time to process what had happened. You were expected to thank the client, to smile and bow, to show appreciation for his generosity. The madam would sweep in to collect payment, to fuss over your kimono, to remind you not to cry. Not now, not ever. You were officially a woman in the eyes of the house, which meant the expectations doubled. Now you could entertain patrons in the main parlour, take on more clients, bring in more money. The house would celebrate with a special meal, sweet rice, maybe a bit of fish, as if a treat could soften what the day had taken from you. For some, there was relief. The dread was over, and now at least you knew what to expect. For others, the sadness lingered for weeks, showing up in quiet moments when the house was asleep, when all the colours of the festival kimono seemed faded and far away. The older courtesans would find ways to comfort you, passing along old tricks, how to hide tears, how to dull the ache, how to make the best of what couldn't be changed. But if you thought this was the end of your trials, you'd be wrong. Miswaj wasn't just a one-night ordeal. It marked the beginning of your real work, long nights entertaining clients, perfecting the art of listening, the game of pretending, the subtle dance of promising just enough to keep them coming back, but never quite enough to give yourself away. You became a professional performer, an expert in the moods and desires of strangers, a master of hiding your real thoughts behind practiced smiles and easy laughter. The clients were a world unto themselves. Some were gentle, eager to show off their manners and taste for poetry. Some were drunk, loud, careless with their words and their hands. Some fell in love quickly, promising everything, and some treated you like an expensive trinket, to be enjoyed and then forgotten. You learned quickly who could be trusted and who couldn't, who was dangerous, and who might, on rare occasion, be a friend. The house watched everything. Every gift you received, every favour granted, every smile that lasted just a little too long. All of it was recorded, measured, added to the long list of debts and credits that followed you from one season to the next. If you were successful, the madam would praise you, maybe even let you keep a little extra money for yourself. Never enough to buy freedom, but enough to buy a few small comforts, a treat, a new comb, maybe a secret letter sent home. If you stumbled, the punishments were swift. Extra chores, public shaming, sometimes a temporary demotion that felt worse than any beating. And yet, through it all, you endured. You learned to smile at the right moment, to hold your tongue when it mattered, to swallow disappointment and turn it into something beautiful, if only for a few hours each night. In the pleasure quarters, growing up meant learning that every celebration came with a shadow, every joy with a price. You never forgot your misouage. Years later, older, wiser, maybe a little harder, you'd remember the way the lanterns flickered that night, the sound of footsteps outside the door, the taste of sweet rice on your tongue when it was all over. It was the night the house stopped seeing you as a girl and started seeing you as an investment. And even though you moved on, more confident, more skilled, more careful than ever before, you carried that memory with you, folded up and hidden in a corner of your heart, as much a part of your story as your name, your kimono, and the endless song of the floating world. A day in the life of a courtesan was a performance that never truly ended. Every sunrise brought the start of another act, another chance to get it right, or at least not to get caught getting it wrong. You woke before dawn, always before the madam, always before the house stirred, slipping out from under the heavy futon so you could beat the line for the single cold wash basin. The first shock of water on your face was the closest you'd get to feeling awake. It was never enough. There was no such thing as sleeping in. Not here. The house had its own pulse, set by the oldest clock in the front room and the footsteps of the senior courtesans as they made their rounds, checking on everyone, even if they pretended not to care. Your first job was to make yourself invisible, quick, silent, already half presentable before anyone came looking. Sloppiness was noticed and punished, and nobody wanted to start the day on the wrong side of the madam's mood. Dressing was a ritual that took nearly as long as the day itself. You began with the basics, wrapping your body in layers, an underrobe, a padded kimono for shape, and finally, the outer kimono, chosen not for comfort, but for how it set off your skin, how it made you look older or younger, depending on who was coming to call. The fabric was beautiful but heavy, decorated with patterns that told stories you'd spent hours memorizing so you could answer any question a guest might ask. A single stain, a loose thread, any mistake was a reason to be sent back, undressed, and started over. The real trial was your hair. Long before the first client arrived, you were bent over a cushion, enduring the pull of combs and pins and wax as the older girls shaped and twisted and built your hair into the style of the season, something towering and elaborate that looked effortless but felt like carrying a small shrine on your head. Sometimes they whispered advice, sometimes they whispered warnings. Don't fidget. Smile even if it hurts. Remember, the guests notice everything. You learn to hide your winces behind laughter, to brush away tears with the back of your sleeve when no one was looking. Makeup came next. White powder, thick and chalky, dusted over your skin until you looked like a painted doll. Your lips became tiny red bows. Your eyebrows, perfect black curves. Some girls hated the transformation, missing the face they used to know. Others saw it as armor, a way to keep the world at bay. Either way, by the time you were finished, you were someone else. Someone meant to be admired, not known. Lessons began soon after. Music, poetry, calligraphy, dancing, etiquette, all woven together, no matter how tired you were or how much your feet ached from the night before. There was always something to memorize. A new song, a clever reply, the details of a guest's last visit. The best courtesans remembered everything. The favorite drink, the story that made a certain client laugh, the secret sadness he'd never admit out loud. Every lesson was a tool, every skill a lifeline. The more you could do, the more you could earn, and the more likely you were to be noticed by the right client. By midday, the house turned into a stage. The air filled with the scent of incense and fresh tatami, the clatter of gaiter sandals in the hall. You'd practice serving tea, pouring sake, arranging the smallest plates of sweets in precisely the right pattern. There was no such thing as a break. Even when you weren't on duty, you were watching, listening, learning how the older girls managed to stay calm in a storm of guests and gossip. When clients arrived in the afternoon, the whole house transformed. Suddenly, every smile mattered, every word was weighed, and every movement became part of the performance. You greeted the guests with a bow, your hands tucked neatly into your sleeves, your eyes bright but never challenging. For each man who crossed the threshold, you became exactly what he wanted to see, a witty conversationalist, a demure beauty, a mysterious muse. The illusion was everything, and the price of breaking it was more work, more scolding, more reminders that you were here to serve, not to be yourself. Some clients were easy, generous, kind, eager to show off their taste for poetry or their knowledge of the latest gossip. Others were rough, impatient, careless with their words, and with you. You learned to read a room faster than most people could read a signpost. If someone was in a bad mood, you found a reason to busy yourself elsewhere. If tempers flared, you calmed them with a joke or a change of subject. It was a skill as important as singing or dancing, maybe more. All the while, the madam watched from the shadows. She saw everything: who laughed too loudly, who poured too much sake, who dared to look bored when a client was telling his favourite story for the third time that week. Praise was rare, but when it came, it felt like sunlight. More often, you measured success by the absence of criticism, the simple relief of making it through another evening without being singled out for correction. There were, in the midst of all this, small moments that belonged just to you and the other girls. A whispered joke as you passed each other in the hall, a secret snack shared when the kitchen was empty, a quick tug at a stubborn obi before you stepped into the main room. These tiny rebellions, these flashes of humour and solidarity, were the glue that held you together. Rivalries existed, but so did friendships, fierce and bright, built on the knowledge that nobody else could understand what it meant to live every day behind the willow fence. Dinner, when it came, was quick and quiet. You ate just enough to keep your strength up, always careful not to appear greedy, always aware that you were still on display. Afterward, the work continued. Lessons, chores, repairs to kimono or hairpieces. You might be sent to deliver a message to another house, to help prepare for a festival, or to run errands that took you out into the city, always watched, always aware that the world outside moved differently, and that you could never quite belong to it. Night brought a change in the air, a sense of anticipation, sometimes dread. This was when the real work happened, when the guests stayed longer and the performances became more intimate. You sang, you danced, you poured more sake, always with a practiced laugh, always ready with the right compliment or clever story. Some nights were easier than others, some felt endless, as if dawn would never come. By the time the last guest left and the house finally went quiet, you were more tired than you could admit. Your feet throbbed, your head ached from the weight of your hair, your smile felt permanently etched on your face. You scrubbed away the makeup, combed out your hair, and slipped back into plain cotton, savouring the fleeting comfort of being, for a moment, just another girl in a room full of tired, hopeful, stubborn survivors. As you drifted off to sleep, you wondered what tomorrow would bring. Another client, another lesson, another test of patience and grace. But you'd face it, as always, with a practiced smile and the quiet strength you'd learned from every day spent in the floating world. A world where beauty was business, every night was a new performance, and the curtain never truly came down. If you asked anyone outside the willow fence what life in the pleasure quarter was really like, you'd get the same dreamy story: music, silk, laughter echoing through the halls, a world where beauty reigned and sorrow was a stranger. Inside, it was a different story. Here, every luxury had a cost, and the real currency wasn't just gold, it was obligation, exhaustion, and a debt so deep you could measure your life by it. The debt was always there, even when you first arrived. Most girls owed for their purchase price, the fee paid to their family, or, just as often, to the broker who delivered them to the brothel's gate. But that was only the beginning. Every lesson, every bowl of rice, every new kimono and every hair ornament was written down, added up and pinned quietly to your future. The books were kept with a precision worthy of a shogun's treasury, and the numbers only ever moved in one direction, up. You'd think, with so much business running through the place, someone might catch a break. But that's not how it worked. The pleasure quarter ran on a system designed to keep you running, always just behind the finish line. Say you landed a generous client, someone who lavished you with gifts, expensive sake, and maybe even the promise of a trip outside the city walls. The house always took a cut, more than a cut really. By the time everyone had claimed their share, you were lucky to see a single coin of your own. The madam always said it was for your own good. After all, how could a young girl be trusted to handle so much money? Much safer for the house to keep it for you, she'd say, tapping her long, lacquered nails on the ledger. And so, every little indulgence, an extra helping at dinner, a replacement comb when yours cracked, a new layer for winter, went straight onto your account. There were stories, always told in a low voice, about girls who spent a lifetime paying off debts that never seemed to shrink. Some made a game of it, counting every cost, keeping their own secret tally, hoping one day the scales might tip in their favour. Most gave up after a while, realising that the numbers didn't matter. The only real currency was time. How long you could last, how much of yourself you could keep hidden from the debts. The madam, for her part, ruled the house like a little kingdom. She decided who ate first, who wore which kimono, who got the best shift or the worst. Some madams were famously cruel, shouting, slapping, making examples of anyone who dared break a rule or ask too many questions. Others prided themselves on being fair, but fairness in the pleasure quarter was measured in small mercies. A soft word after a hard day, a warning before a punishment, maybe a few minutes of privacy to cry when no one could see. Either way, her word was law, and her mood set the weather for everyone inside the house. Discipline was a daily threat, as much a part of life as brushing your hair or painting your face. Minor mistakes, forgetting to bow, spilling sake, laughing too loudly, could mean extra chores, missed meals, or a sharp word in front of everyone. Bigger mistakes were met with bigger punishments. Being caught trying to sneak out. That could mean being locked in a storeroom, tied up, or even sent to work in a rougher, poorer house where the rules were harsher and the food always ran out. Nobody wanted to end up there. Everyone knew a story about someone who had. But not all punishment was so clear-cut. Sometimes the house punished in quieter ways. A missing treat at dinner, the best kimono going to someone else, a friend suddenly cold for reasons she wouldn't explain. Rivalries simmered just beneath the surface. The fight for the best clients, the chance at an easier night, a word of praise from the madam. These things mattered, and every girl learned to keep her guard up. Allies were important, but alliances shifted quickly. You could share a secret with a friend at breakfast, then see her pass it on to the madam by dinner. Still, friendship persisted. There were always a few girls who watched out for each other, sharing advice and stolen sweets, covering for a friend who needed an extra moment to compose herself before facing a difficult guest. And there were small rebellions, tiny, nearly invisible acts of resistance, a secret note passed in the hall, an extra scoop of rice snuck out of the kitchen and shared in a dark corner, a favourite comb slipped into a pocket for safekeeping when you knew you'd be blamed for something you hadn't done. Sometimes it was as simple as laughing at the wrong moment, a joke between friends when you were supposed to be silent, a dance step done just a little too boldly. These things rarely changed your fate, but they mattered. They reminded you that you were still a person, not just a number on a ledger or a pair of painted lips in a crowded room. Sometimes, though, the pressure was too much. Girls broke down. The strongest, loudest, brightest girls sometimes disappeared for a day or two, shut up in a spare room or sent to another house for a while. When they came back, they were changed. Quieter, more careful, eyes that seemed to look right through you. There were whispers about girls who ran away and were never seen again, about punishments that left scars, inside and out. It was a reminder to everyone. The pleasure quarter might have been a world apart, but it was still a cage, and the bars were everywhere. Yet, through it all, life found a way to keep moving. There were birthdays marked by tiny cakes, festival nights where the house let everyone stay up late, and rare afternoons when the sunlight slipped through the paper windows just right and, for a moment, the world outside didn't seem so far away. There was pride too, pride in mastering a new song, in wearing the most beautiful kimono, in catching a client's eye with a single clever phrase. These victories were small, but they mattered. They helped you remember who you were, or at least who you wanted to be. For some, the only hope lay in the stories of girls who paid off their debts and walked out the front gate, heads held high. Stories of clients who fell in love, bought a girl's freedom, and whisked her away to a better life. Everyone knew these were mostly fairy tales, but it didn't stop you from dreaming about them, especially on nights when the world felt just a little too heavy. In the end, debt was the river that ran beneath everything in the pleasure quarter. You learned to live with it, to bargain with it, to dance on its banks without ever quite falling in. You watched the numbers grow, the seasons turn, and your own reflection in the mirror. Older, wiser, still hoping, even if only for something as small as a day without punishment, or a night where your laughter was real. That was the secret that kept you going, the knowledge that, even in a world built on rules and debts and discipline, there was still room for tiny acts of kindness, for stubborn little joys, for friendships that outlasted the hardest days. And maybe, just maybe, for the hope that someday the ledger would close, the doors would open, and you'd find your way to a different life, one where you owed nothing to anyone but yourself. No one who passed through the willow fence ever forgot the price of beauty. In the floating world, appearance wasn't just important. It was the only thing standing between you and disaster. It started early and never let up. The rituals, the routines, the little tortures disguised as elegance. Even after years in the quarter, you could always recognize a new girl by her awkward walk, her stiff smile, the way she flinched every time the hairdresser's comb caught on a tangle. Within a few months, even the most delicate country girl moved with the slow, measured grace of someone who knew that every step was being judged. Each morning, it began again. Long before the first guest arrived, you endured hours at the hands of the older courtesans, who pulled and pinned and teased your hair into the latest towering style. They'd twist it up with wax and ribbons and tuck in enough ornaments to make your scalp ache for days. Sometimes you swore you could feel each individual strand protesting, and at night you'd lie awake with your head perched carefully on a wooden pillow, terrified of undoing the entire creation with a single wrong move. The makeup was just as punishing. There was the white lead powder, chalky, heavy, smothering every bit of your skin. It hid blemishes and erased freckles, but it stung when you sweated, and it never quite washed off. Your eyebrows were drawn in thick, perfect arches. Your teeth were sometimes blackened with dye, your lips painted into tiny, rigid hearts. The air was thick with the smell of wax and rice powder and incense, clinging to everything, even your dreams. Then there was the kimono, layer after layer, each heavier than the last, tied with an obi so tight you learned to take shallow breaths and hold yourself straight, no matter how tired you were. It took practice to walk without stumbling, to kneel without creasing the fabric, to sit perfectly still while someone adjusted a sleeve or retied your sash for the 100th time. On festival days, when you wore the house's best kimono, the weight could feel like penance, a constant reminder that beauty in Yoshiwara was earned, not given, and underneath it all, the pain you didn't show. The blisters on your feet from wooden sandals that never quite fit, the bruises on your shins from kneeling too long, the soreness in your back and shoulders that never fully went away. You learned to smile through headaches and rashes, to hide the itch of a wig that hadn't been washed in weeks, to keep your voice light even as exhaustion pressed in around the edges of your vision. But it wasn't just the outside that hurt. The floating world was a breeding ground for illness, and every girl knew someone who had fallen sick. There were the obvious threats: colds that lingered, fevers that never broke, mysterious aches that spread from girl to girl like gossip. Sometimes it was something worse. The old hands called it the sickness, a quiet word for diseases no one dared name out loud, the ones that came from too many clients, too little care, and a world that looked the other way. There was no doctor in residence. If you got sick, you hoped for a kind madam who might call in a herbalist or send for one of the city's old women who brewed bitter medicines from roots and moss. More often, you got a dose of sake, a scolding for missing your shift, and a warning not to spread your cough to the clients. The lucky girls recovered. The unlucky ones didn't. Sometimes a girl would disappear from her room overnight, her futon neatly folded, her name quietly erased from the ledgers. No one ever talked about where she'd gone. You just learned to look away. When epidemics swept the city, smallpox, tuberculosis, worse, life inside the quarter ground to a halt. The gates were locked, the lanterns darkened, and everyone waited, silent and anxious, until the worst had passed. The fear was always there, humming just below the surface. Some girls wore talismans around their necks, tucked secret charms into the lining of their kimono, whispered prayers for health when no one was listening. Others turned to superstition, never stepping over the threshold with your left foot, never cutting your hair during a full moon, never speaking the names of the dead. The madam liked to pretend the house was immune to tragedy. She insisted on daily baths, fresh linens, regular hair washing, and clean hands before every meal. But even the best routines couldn't keep sickness out forever. The older courtesans kept a mental tally of who had made it through which fever, who had the strongest constitution, who could work through pain, and who had to be carried out when the night was over. The worst pain, though, wasn't always visible. The pressure to be perfect, to perform, to attract the best clients, to never show fear or fatigue, took its toll. Some girls coped by laughing everything off, telling jokes at their own expense, turning every slip or mistake into a story for the back room. Others turned quiet, keeping to themselves, pouring all their effort into the small, private rituals that made life bearable. A letter home, a few extra minutes of sleep, a stolen bite of something sweet. There were always girls who broke. They'd miss a step, lose a client, forget a poem, and find themselves spiraling, punished by the madam, shunned by rivals, left alone with their thoughts. Sometimes the only comfort came from the friendships that formed in the shadows. A shared treat at midnight, a whispered reassurance, a promise that things would get better, or at least that you weren't alone. These small kindnesses mattered more than anyone admitted. They were a reminder that underneath the powder and silk, you were still a person, tired, bruised, stubborn, and real. As the months turned into years, you learned to count victories in little ways. A day without a headache. A client who made you laugh for real. A festival where the pain in your feet faded just enough for you to dance with joy, if only for a few moments. You learned the art of endurance, the science of hiding, the magic of turning pain into beauty. Some days the act felt easy, others it was the hardest thing you'd ever done. Every so often, late at night, you'd catch sight of yourself in a polished mirror, a stranger's face looking back, painted and perfect, framed by candlelight. You'd remember the girl you'd been before all this, the one who ran barefoot through fields, who laughed without covering her mouth, who never had to worry about the colour of her lips or the line of her eyebrows. Maybe you missed her, maybe you envied her, but you also knew she couldn't have survived here, not as you had. In the end, the floating world taught you to live with pain, to hide it, to make it part of the story you showed the world. The cost of beauty was steep, but so was the price of hope, and every girl, in her own way, paid both, day after day, night after night, beneath the lantern light. Of course, there was pain that didn't show up on skin or in feverish eyes. Sometimes it arrived with a joke, a glance, or a name scribbled into the guest book in a rush of expensive ink. For all the rules about beauty and debt, nothing in the pleasure quarter was as strictly regulated or as endlessly negotiated as the business of the heart. Let's get rid of the biggest fantasy right away. Real love wasn't just discouraged in Yoshiwara, it was a logistical nightmare. The problem was, clients didn't always know that, and sometimes neither did the girls. There were rules about touching, rules about smiling, rules about how many times you could pour sake for a certain man before someone started writing rumours in the margins. But rules, as every courtesan quickly learned, were just the first round in a much bigger game. Every night you played a dozen different roles. Sometimes you were a clever matchmaker, sometimes a tragically beautiful muse, sometimes just the ideal listener, nodding at the right moments, laughing at jokes you'd heard 3 times that week, or offering a gentle, "That must have been difficult for you, sir," while refilling the sake cup. The idea was to make each guest believe he was the only story worth telling. If you happened to remember his favourite poem, or, better yet, the name of his least favourite rival, you could stretch a single visit into a season's worth of attention. But even the best actresses can lose track of their lines. Once in a while, a client actually believed the performance, and every so often, a courtesan did too. That's where things got complicated. There was a whole genre of heartbreak in Yoshiwara built on misunderstandings, whispered confessions, and impossible plans. The regulars who fell in love and loudly promised to buy a girl's freedom were legendary, mostly for how little they delivered. Some showed up every week, pockets full of empty promises and half-written love poems. Others tried to outbid the competition, convinced that money could unlock a life together on the outside. Everyone knew how rare a buyout actually was. The madame kept a ledger for such things. The cost of lessons, the cost of kimonos, the cost of dinners, the cost of breathing, apparently, because the total always seemed to hover just out of reach, no matter how many gifts a client sent. Still, the fantasy endured. It sold more repeat visits than the best dance or the prettiest poem. If you were smart, you let the dream live, just long enough to keep the bills paid and the madam happy. If you weren't, you risked getting your heart broken in a place that never ran out of ways to make the hurt last. And it wasn't just the clients with dreams. Among the girls, there were crushes, alliances, rivalries, and every shade of friendship and betrayal you could imagine. Someone always fell for someone else's regular, or trusted the wrong promise, or read too much into a look across the dinner table. Rumours were the house's real currency, more valuable than coins, more contagious than a spring cold. One whispered word, and the pecking order could change overnight. For a courtesan, heartbreak was never private. If a regular stopped coming, everyone noticed. If a girl was suddenly distracted, slower with her jokes, or quicker to take offence, the other courtesans would close ranks, either offering comfort or quietly taking advantage of her distraction to snag a better client. The madam, for her part, had seen it all before. "Keep your eyes on the numbers," she'd say, "not on the poetry." Easy advice, hard to follow. And yet, despite the warnings, little rebellions happened. Letters slipped into sleeves, secret tokens passed between hands. Sometimes 2 people, client and courtesan, or even 2 girls, actually managed to carve out something real, even if it only lasted a handful of nights. These affairs were always risky. If discovered, the punishment could be harsh: fewer privileges, demotion, a move to another house, or just the cold shoulder from everyone until you got the message. But that hint of risk, for some, it was the only thing that made the endless parade of faces bearable. There were, too, those who perfected the art of detachment. The veterans. The ones who could look a man in the eyes, say exactly what he needed to hear, and leave every emotion behind when the night ended. Some called them cold, others called them smart. Most of the younger girls secretly wished they could do the same, at least until the right glance or the right story came along, and all that armour melted away. At the heart of it all was the simple truth that everyone wanted something. Some wanted love, some wanted power, some just wanted to be remembered. Yoshiwara thrived on this churn of desire, always selling a dream with one hand and keeping the receipt with the other. There was a certain tragic comedy to it, a room full of people, each pretending for the other, each hoping the game would turn real for just a moment. And every so often, against all odds, it did. After the guests had gone and the lamps were blown out, the girls would gather in the dark, trading stories about near misses and close calls, love notes gone wrong, and gifts that came with strings attached. Someone would laugh, someone else might cry, and the next morning, everyone would paint on the same perfect smile, ready to step back into the game. That was the floating world's cruelest trick. The more you learned about love, the more you realised it was just another part of the performance. And if you were very lucky, or very clever, you might just manage to keep a little piece of your heart hidden away, safe from the stories, the debts, and the endless turning of the seasons outside the willow fence. If anyone tells you life in the pleasure quarters was one big sisterhood of mutual support and late-night hair braiding, just know that's about as accurate as a love letter written by a drunk samurai. The reality was messier. Think less chosen family and more survival reality show where half the cast is plotting and the other half is trying to find a clean hairpin. From the moment you arrived, you learned the rules of the house weren't just posted on wooden boards. They were written in glances, whispered behind paper screens, and enforced by girls who had as much to gain from your mistakes as from their own successes. Rivalry was as thick in the air as incense. Sometimes it was sharp and obvious. Someone accidentally tripped you on the way to serve a client, or borrowed your best kimono without asking, leaving you to explain to the madam why there was suddenly a mysterious stain shaped exactly like someone else's clumsy lunch. Other times it was subtle, a rumour let slip at just the right moment, or a compliment so pointed it made you check your own reflection twice to see what was wrong. But here's the twist. Rivalry and friendship weren't opposites here. They were tangled up in the same long nights and too tight living quarters. You could bicker over the prettiest comb at breakfast, then team up to hide a favourite snack from the greedy hands of the kitchen staff by lunch. Survival in Yoshiwara meant keeping your friends close, your enemies closer, and your best jokes reserved for the handful of girls you actually trusted not to repeat them to the madam. Still, even the tightest alliances could shift with the weather. One day you'd share a whispered secret, or a stolen glance out the window. The next, you'd hear your own words repeated, just slightly twisted, in the main hall, and realise trust was as fragile as a paper lantern in the rain. Some girls collected secrets like other people collected fans, wielding them as both shield and sword. Others gave up, kept to themselves, and perfected the art of looking busy whenever anyone came looking for gossip. Evenings in the back rooms, when the clients were gone and the madam had retired to count her coins, could feel almost like real camaraderie. The youngest girls would huddle together, swapping ghost stories and daring each other to sneak a peek at the supposedly haunted end of the corridor. The older ones lounged in a circle, rolling their eyes at the latest client's terrible haiku or critiquing someone's love letter with all the seriousness of a poetry contest. Sometimes laughter filled the room, wild, irreverent, the kind that left your cheeks sore and your heart lighter, if only for a moment. Sometimes the only sound was quiet humming, the kind of music you only sang for people who'd seen you ugly cry after a particularly bad night. Of course, every house had its own queen bee, usually an oiran with a fan collection larger than most people's wardrobes, and a memory like a tax accountant. She knew every trick, every weakness, every mistake you'd made since your first day in wooden sandals. Some wielded their power with casual cruelty, doling out advice like poison disguised as honey. Others actually looked out for the girls below them, offering a quick word of warning, a hidden treat, or, on rare, golden afternoons, permission to rest when no one was watching. You never quite knew which version you'd get, and that uncertainty kept you sharp. Solidarity wasn't a myth, but it wasn't guaranteed. Some days it showed up in the smallest gestures, covering for a girl who needed a moment to cry, distracting the madam with a well-timed joke while a friend snuck a forbidden letter out the back gate. Some nights it was everyone agreeing, without ever saying it out loud, that nobody was going to mention the smashed vase, or the fact that the senior girl's favourite customer definitely left less happy than he arrived. Still, the line between support and sabotage was blurry. The same girl who handed you her spare ribbon before a big parade might be the first to tell the madam you'd been slacking on your chores. If you rose too fast, became too popular, or caught the eye of a client everyone wanted, you could expect your shoes to go missing or your favourite comb to mysteriously break. It was all part of the dance, the sideways glances, the strategic alliances, the endless calculations that never quite added up to friendship, but didn't count as enemies either. You learned to find your people, even if your people changed every few weeks. Sometimes you got lucky and landed in a room with a girl who shared your sense of humour, or knew when to let the silence stretch without turning it into a new rumour. Other times, you survived on quick wit and even quicker apologies, knowing that grudges lasted as long as the cherry blossoms, spectacular and gone in a blink. And yet, when trouble really hit, when a girl fell sick, or the madam's temper flared, or a client's bad mood threatened everyone, you saw the best of Yoshiwara. Girls who barely spoke would band together to get the work done, cover each other's mistakes, or smuggle a treat into a sick friend's room when nobody was looking. The world outside might think you were rivals or rivals in training, but on the worst days, you realized you were the only family you had. That's what the floating world did best. It made everything complicated. Friendship wasn't a fairy tale, rivalry wasn't pure villainy, and nobody fit into a neat little box. Some nights, the person you wanted to scream at was the only one who understood why you couldn't stop crying. Some mornings, the girl who cost you a client last week was the same one who sat up all night to make sure your fever broke. If there was any secret to surviving Yoshiwara, it was knowing how to play both sides. When to keep a secret, when to share a laugh, and when to forgive the kind of betrayal that would have ended a friendship anywhere else. You learned to find comfort in the chaos, a kind of stubborn joy in knowing you could outlast the worst nights and still find a way to laugh about it in the morning. In the end, the pleasure quarter was a strange, fragile ecosystem, equal parts battleground and sanctuary, a place where enemies could become allies by sunset and friends could turn into strangers by dawn. You kept your guard up, your sense of humour sharp, and your best stories ready for the rare moments when you could let your guard down, even just for a little while. Because if you couldn't find a way to laugh at the madness, you were probably in the wrong business. There comes a time, even in the floating world, when the curtain falls and the applause, such as it was, dies out. Nobody likes to talk about what happens to a courtesan when the years catch up, when the new girls walk faster, sing sweeter, and know just a bit more about the latest poetry or fashion. But every girl in Yoshiwara knew the endings, whispered about them like ghost stories after midnight. Aging out wasn't glamorous, no matter what the woodblock prints liked to show. If you were lucky, maybe you retired with a little fanfare. A quiet farewell dinner, a gift from a grateful client, a careful handover of your combs and keepsakes to the girls coming up behind you. Most of the time, it was less ceremony, more subtle shift. The madam started assigning you fewer important clients, your debts stubbornly lingering, and the mirror told you what the house would not. You became a background player in someone else's show, remembered for a line or two, a certain laugh, a joke from the old days. And if you didn't already have a plan, Now was the time to scramble for one. For the lucky and well-connected, there were a handful of exits. Sometimes a long-time regular, usually someone with more money than sense, finally paid off your debts and married you out. These stories made the rounds like fairy tales, growing grander with every retelling. Did you hear? She lives in a big house on the river now. Silk futons, 2 maids. She never lifts a finger. More often, the truth was simpler. Maybe a modest wedding, maybe a life running a tea house or shop, maybe just a little more safety than you'd ever had before. Some girls were adopted by patrons, given a new name, a little cash, and a chance to fade quietly into another life. For a few, religion was the final exit. They shaved their heads, took up the Buddhist robes, and found a peace the willow fence never could provide. But for every happy ending, there were others, less told, but just as common. The girls whose youth ran out before their debts did. The ones moved to lesser houses, the ones who ended up as maids or cooks or invisible helpers, drifting through the back halls of the very world that once celebrated them. Some disappeared quietly, sent away to the countryside to live out their days with a few old souvenirs and a head full of stories nobody else wanted to hear. A few found themselves truly alone, slipping through the cracks in a city that never stopped moving. Maybe that's why the floating world clung so tightly to its stories, to the tales of girls who vanished and were said to haunt the willow fence, trailing perfume and heartbreak in their wake. Yoshiwara had no shortage of ghosts, if you believed the rumours. Some said you could hear the soft clatter of gaita in an empty hallway, or catch a glimpse of a girl in festival kimono out of the corner of your eye, just before the lanterns went out. Even the most practical madams sometimes left a sweet on the doorstep during Obon, just in case an old friend came calling. Yet for all its shadows, Yoshiwara left a mark on the world outside. Fashion, music, dance. The city borrowed more than just stories from the pleasure quarter. The courtesans set the trends, invented the slang, inspired art and theatre, and even shaped the way love letters were written. Centuries later, you can still find echoes of their style in the way someone ties a sash or sings a line of poetry on a rainy night. What's left of Yoshiwara now? Mostly memories and old stones, a few faded signboards tucked between modern buildings, a street or two that remembers what it once was, if you know how to look. The rest is legend, a world of lantern light and secrets, laughter and longing, painted faces and stories too complicated for bedtime. There are walking tours and museums, sure, but the real floating world lives on in the cracks between stories, half remembered, half imagined, as slippery and beautiful as a festival dream. If you're still awake, you might wonder, would you have survived? Would you have kept your secrets, found your allies, learned to smile through pain and loss and the endless debt of beauty? Or would you too haunt these streets, slipping between the shadows, a rumour in someone else's tale? Whatever the answer, rest easy. The world outside the willow fence has its own rules and its own stories, not always softer, but at least a little freer. If the ghosts of Yoshiwara linger, maybe it's only because, for a while, they knew how to turn struggle into spectacle, pain into poetry, and ordinary girls into legends, even if nobody told them how the story would end. So pull your blanket a little higher, close your eyes, and let the lanterns fade. In the floating world, every night is a new beginning, and every ending, just another story waiting to be told.